Boston, September 1873. The letter had been sitting on Eleanor Hayes's desk for 3 days. Not because she had not read it. She had read it 4 times, each reading slower than the last, her pencil moving across the margins, where she tracked numbers and inconsistencies, the way other women track gossip. She had read it the way she read every contract that passed through the accounting office of St. Catherine's Orphanage, looking not just at what the words said, but at what they chose not to say. The letter was from a man named Harlan Calloway, rancher, Montana Territory, 4,000 acres of cattle land in the mountains west of the Yellowstone River. He needed a wife. He did not say he wanted one. That distinction, more than anything else, was what kept Ellie reading. Most of the letters she had seen pinned to the board at the back of the parish hall were performances. Men who described themselves as lonely poets living beside sapphire lakes. Men who promised hearts as open as the western sky. Ellie had grown up in an orphanage and had learned early that the more elaborate the promise, the more carefully you should guard what you had. She had nothing to guard, but she had learned the lesson anyway. Harlan Calloway's letter contained no poetry. It contained a description of the ranch, the elevation, the number of cattle, the severity of the winters, and the specific duties a capable woman would be expected to perform. It mentioned 2 younger brothers. It mentioned that the nearest doctor was 11 miles down the mountain. It mentioned without sentiment that the previous woman he had intended to marry had passed away 2 years prior. He did not describe how. He did not describe himself in flattering terms. He wrote that he was 33 years old, that he had run the ranch since he was 19, and that he preferred plain speech to decoration. Ellie had written plain speech in the margin beside that last line. Then she had circled it. She was 22 years old. In 6 days, St. Catherine's would close its doors for the last time. The diocese had run out of money and patience in that order, and the dozen older residents who had stayed on as staff would be turned out into a Boston that had little use for women whose only home had been a building that no longer existed. Ellie was not afraid. She had never been afraid of hard work or honest conditions. What frightened her, in the quiet and rational way that she allowed herself to be frightened, was the absence of a next step. She had a small trunk, a winter coat $40, and a skill set that Boston in 1873 did not particularly want from a woman without family connections. Harlan Calloway's letter was a next step. She opened the envelope one last time to reread the final paragraph. The paper unfolded and she turned to the last page, and that was when she noticed what she had somehow missed on 4 previous readings. Tucked between the second and third pages, so flat and still that it had felt like nothing more than an extra fold, was a second piece of paper. Smaller, different handwriting entirely. Cramped and quick, the letters pressed hard into the page as though written by someone whose hand was not entirely steady. Do not come. The mountain keeps what it takes. No signature. Ellie set both pages down on the desk. She looked at the warning for a long time. She turned it over. Nothing on the back. The paper was the same quality as the letter paper, which meant it had been placed inside the envelope before sealing, not inserted afterward by some third party at the post office. Someone in the Calloway house, or someone with access to Harlan Calloway's correspondence, had put that warning inside the envelope and then allowed it to be sent anyway. She picked up her pencil and wrote in the margin of her notepad, "Who wrote this, and why did they not simply prevent the letter from being sent at all?" She thought about that question for a long time. Then she closed the notepad, walked to the wardrobe, and began deciding what to pack. It was precisely because of the warning that she decided to go. Not because she was reckless, though some might have called it that, because the warning told her something the letter had not. It told her there was something on that mountain worth knowing about something that at least one person was frightened of, and that person had chosen a whisper over silence. In Ellie's experience, people who whispered instead of acted were people who were trapped, and trapped people needed help they could not ask for directly. She wrote back to Harlan Calloway. She would arrive the 1st of October. The 12 days by rail from Boston to the Montana Territory gave Ellie the kind of solitude she had rarely experienced. St. Catharines had been a place of constant noise and movement, and Ellie had learned to think inside noise the way some people learn to sleep inside it. Now the train rocked westward through the lengthening evenings, and she sat in her second-class seat with her notepad open and her pencil moving, and the quiet was almost loud. She reread Harlan's letters in order, all three of them. She made 2 columns on a fresh page. What he mentioned, what he did not. The second column filled up faster. He had written at length about cattle yield and water rights and the condition of the pastures in drought years. He had written nothing about neighbors, nothing about the church, which was nearly unthinkable for a frontier settler writing a marriage proposition in 1873. Nothing about community gatherings, seasonal celebrations, the social fabric of a place where 3 generations of families had apparently put down roots. A ranch of 4,000 acres with 3 grown men on it existed based on these letters in a kind of social vacuum. She wrote the word isolated with 2 lines under it and drew a small box around it. In Laramie, Wyoming, a woman of about 50 sat down across from her in the dining car. Her name was Mrs. Doris Hutchins, wife of a dry goods merchant, and she was friendly in the generous and talkative way of women who spend a great deal of time alone in large houses. Ellie found her company a relief after 9 days of her own thoughts. It was the mention of Callaway Mountain that changed the woman's face. It was not fear. Ellie was precise about these things. Mrs. Hutchins did not flinch or pale or look around the dining car to see who was listening. What moved across her expression was something quieter and more lasting. It was the look of a woman who had been told something a long time ago that she had never been able to stop thinking about, and who had not expected to hear the name connected to it spoken aloud in a train dining car in Wyoming. She recovered quickly. She said that she had heard the mountain was beautiful, but that outsiders rarely stayed long. Then she asked Ellie about Boston. Ellie let the conversation turn. But she wrote in her notepad that evening, outsiders rarely stay long, reason unknown, follow up. Salvation Station, Montana Territory was the smallest and most aptly named stop Ellie had ever seen. 4 walls of weathered lumber, a rusted stovepipe, and a sign that had lost most of its paint to a decade of mountain winters. The platform was empty when she stepped down from the train. A lean dog slept under a bench and did not wake up when she walked past it. She waited for 1 hour. She used the time to observe the station and the single road that led away from it into the tree line. The road vanished into shadow after about 100 yards. The pines on either side of it were old and dense and very still. She noted that the station had no telegraph wire connected to it. Whatever happened in Callaway Mountain stayed in Callaway Mountain unless someone chose to carry the news down on horseback. She also noticed the sign. She had seen it when she stepped off the train, but had attributed the carved letters to old settlement humor, the kind of dark joke that frontier people made about their own hardships. But when she walked closer and looked at the bottom edge of the main board below the official lettering, she saw that the carving was recent. The wood inside of the cut marks was pale and clean, barely weathered. Someone had made those marks within the last few days. The last stop before the mountain takes you. She stood reading those words when she heard the horses. The wagon that came out of the tree line was large and well-built, pulled by 2 black horses that moved with the trained ease of animals used to working that road in all conditions. The man driving it was difficult to assess at a distance because he was simply very large, the kind of large that made the wagon seat look like furniture built for a different scale. He wore a dark brown vest over a work shirt and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen several seasons of hard use. He drove the horses with the easy minimal movement of someone who had been doing it for decades. He stepped down from the wagon before it had fully stopped. He was tall enough that stepping down from a wagon was not much different from stepping off a low porch. He had dark chestnut hair pushed back from a strong face and eyes the color of aged whiskey and the hands of a man who worked with them every day of his adult life. He looked at her with the direct appraisal of someone assessing a practical situation rather than performing a social greeting. "Miss Hayes," he said. It was not a question. "Mr. Calloway." She matched his tone exactly. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not a smile, more like the recognition of a particular kind of person, the kind who does not need the soft edges that other people require. He lifted her trunk as though it weighed nothing and secured it in the wagon bed. He indicated the passenger seat. "We need to be back before full dark." He climbed up and took the reins without looking to see if she had followed. She had followed. She settled herself and looked at the road ahead. "What did you she asked. He took a moment before answering. The road is harder to read in full dark, especially for someone who does not know it. He had not answered her question. She filed that away and said nothing more for the first mile. The ride up the mountain took 2 hours, and Harlan Calloway turned out to be a man of considerably more substance than his first impression suggested, which was the best kind of man in Ellie's estimation. He answered her questions about the ranch with the precision of someone who had been managing large operations since he was young enough that he had learned to speak about them accurately rather than impressively. She asked about water access, winter supply lines, the nearest medical care, and the structure of communication with the outside world during the months when snow closed the road. He answered all of these without embellishment. When she asked about the community, he paused for half a second too long before answering that it was self-governed and that Aldous Wheeler served as its leader. He described it without adjectives. He did not say it was good or close-knit or any of the things that people generally said about communities they trusted. She asked about the social calendar, whether there were regular gatherings, harvest celebrations, the kinds of things she would expect as the wife of a man who clearly had standing among his neighbors. He said the community had its own traditions. Then he went quiet in a way that told her the subject was finished. She looked out at the darkening forest pressing close on either side of the road and allowed the subject to be finished because she had already learned what she needed from the pause before his answer and the words he had chosen to use. Self-governed, its own traditions, a community that did not advertise itself to outsiders even in the casual way of people describing their home. The Calloway Ranch materialized out of the darkness like something built to outlast the mountain itself. The main house was 2 stories of heavy timber lit from within so that the windows threw warm blocks of light across a yard just beginning to receive its first thin frosting of autumn cold. There was a massive barn to one side, outbuildings behind it, and a fenced pasture that disappeared into the darkness at the edge of the lamp glow. It was a serious operation, the kind that took generations to build, and Ellie could see at a glance that the men who ran it had not let anything fall into disrepair. She also noticed, before she noticed anything else pleasant about the place, that the barn gate had a new lock on it. Heavy, expensive, inconsistent with the rest of the hardware on the property. 2 men came out when the wagon pulled in. The first was built like the side of a building and moved with the contained energy of someone who had trained himself not to take up as much space as he naturally would. He had Harlan's look, auburn where Harlan was dark, and the same whiskey-colored eyes, and he greeted her with a handshake that was polite in the way that careful men are polite when they are assessing something they have not decided what to do about yet. This was Roe, the middle brother, and Ellie cataloged him immediately as a man who had decided how the world worked and was not interested in having that decision challenged. The third man was different. He stood at the top of the porch steps leaning against the post with his arms crossed, and when she came close enough to see his face in the lamplight, she saw that where his brothers wore their expressions like armor, this one wore his like a window. He was the youngest dark blonde with the same amber eyes, broader in the shoulders than a 25-year-old had any right to be, and he was looking at her with the frank and open attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what he was seeing rather than simply cataloging it for practical purposes. "You made it?" he said as though he had been uncertain she would. "I made it," she agreed. "I'm Jasper." He came down the steps and shook her hand like a person, not like a transaction. "I'm the only one of us who can cook without incident." "I can cook," Rose said from somewhere behind her. "You can boil water," Jasper replied. "Those are different skills." It was the first thing that had felt ordinary since she had stepped off the train. Dinner was quiet but not uncomfortable. Harlan explained the household structure with the same directness he had applied to everything else. What Ellie's primary responsibilities would be, how the ranch operated across the seasons, what she could expect in terms of supplies and communication with the nearest town. Roe added practical details when they seemed necessary. Jasper asked her about Boston, about what she had read recently, about whether she had ever seen the ocean from the water rather than the shore, and listened to her answers the way people listen when they actually want to know. Before she went upstairs, Harlan spoke one more time. "One rule about the property," he said. He was looking at the table when he said it, not at her. "Don't go out at night after dark, particularly not toward the eastern tree line." He glanced up briefly. "The terrain is rough and the footing is unreliable. I would rather not have an accident in the first week." Roe was looking at his coffee cup. Jasper was looking at his hands. Neither of them looked at her when Harlan said it, and neither of them looked at Harlan when he said it, and that told Ellie more than the words themselves. She said she understood and thanked them for dinner and went upstairs with her lamp. Her room was at the end of the second-floor hallway, a clean and functional space with a pine bed frame, a washstand, a small writing desk by the window, and a wardrobe that smelled of cedar, and something else, something faint and recent, like a room that had been scrubbed more thoroughly than strictly necessary. The window faced east. She stood at it for a moment and looked out at the dark shape of the forest in the distance, a wall of shadow under a sky full of stars, and thought about unreliable footing and terrain that was rough at night. Then she unpacked her trunk with the efficiency of someone who had never had a room large enough to waste space in, and she sat at the writing desk and opened her notepad. She wrote Eastern Tree Line, off limits. Both brothers looked away when this was mentioned. Not a safety rule, something else. She was about to close the notepad when she dropped her pencil. It rolled off the desk and skidded under the bed, and when she knelt to retrieve it, her hand brushed against the edge of the fourth-floor board from the wall and felt it give. Just slightly, just enough. She sat back on her heels and looked at the board in the lamplight. It was fractionally raised at one end, the wood slightly discolored where it had been lifted, and replaced more than once, the grain compressed along the edges in a way that the boards on either side were not. She waited. She had learned to wait. Patience was a skill that the years in St. Catherine's had refined in her beyond what most people ever developed. She sat at her desk and read until the house went quiet, one voice at a time, until the last light downstairs went dark, and the only sounds were wind in the eaves and the distant low sound of cattle settling for the night. Then she knelt by the floorboard and pried it up with the edge of her penknife. A folded handkerchief, white cotton aged softened to the color of old cream. She unfolded it in the lamplight. Inside was a silver hairbrush. The handle was about 6 inches long, the silver still bright in the center where hands had worn away the tarnish dimmed at the edges. The back was engraved with a pattern of climbing roses, precise and old. On the handle near the neck, 2 initials had been set into the silver by a professional hand. WB. She turned the brush over. She ran her thumb along the underside of the handle, feeling for anything that was not decoration, and her thumbnail caught on a seam near the base where the original smooth surface had been broken. Not by the silversmith, by something sharper and less controlled, a pin or a small knife. She brought the lamp closer. Scratched into the soft underside of the handle in letters so small she had to tilt the brush to catch the light at the right angle were 3 words. She never left. Ellie set the brush down on the floor in front of her and looked at it for a long moment. WB, the previous woman, the one who had passed away 2 years prior. Harlan Calloway had said passed away. He had not said she left or she moved on or any of the language that people use when someone goes away alive. She never left. Ellie rewrapped the brush in the handkerchief and replaced it under the board and pressed the wood back into place. She went to her desk and wrote WB previous woman full name, unknown to me, passed away 2 years ago. Brush hidden, not discarded. 3 words scratched inside the handle. Whoever left this wanted it found, but also wanted it hidden. These are not compatible motivations unless the person was afraid. She slept 4 hours that night and was up before anyone else in the house. The morning was the kind of cold that comes when the mountains have been hoarding the previous night's temperatures and release them all at once with the dawn. She pulled on her coat and walked the yard while the sky lightened from black to the particular dark blue that precedes actual color. The barn was on her left, the outbuildings behind it, and the east pasture ahead of her bordered by fence and then by forest. She walked the fence line. Not toward the eastern tree line, not technically because she stayed on the pasture side of the fence. But she could see the tree line clearly from there in the early light, and she could see that the ground at the edge of the forest was different from the ground in the open pasture. Flatter more, even the grass, shorter in some places, and absent entirely in others, in a pattern that was regular enough to be deliberate but irregular enough to have been that way for a long time. She counted 7 places where the ground was different. Then Jasper appeared at the back door of the house with 2 cups of coffee, and she turned away from the fence line and walked back across the yard, and the look on his face when she accepted the cup told her that he had seen where she was standing. He did not mention it. He talked about the coffee and the weather and whether the first snow would come before or after the 20th of October, and Ellie let him talk and drank her coffee and waited. "The woman whose initials are on the hairbrush," she said when there was a natural pause. "What was her full name?" Jasper looked at his cup. The steam from the coffee curled in the cold air between them. He did not look surprised that she had asked, which told her he had expected the question, which told her he knew about the brush, which told her either he had put it there or he knew who had. "Wren Brennan," he said. "She was my brother's intended, 2 years ago." "How did she die?" A pause. The official word was accident, and the unofficial word. He looked up at her then, and what she saw in his face was the particular expression of someone who has been waiting a very long time to be asked the right question by someone who might actually understand the answer. Not desperation, closer to relief. "I haven't settled on a word for it yet," he said quietly. Rose's footsteps on the stairs inside the house ended the conversation, and Jasper straightened and turned away, and Ellie carried the mystery of Ren Brennan back into the kitchen with her morning coffee and did not write anything about it in her notepad until she was alone. Martha Holt came that afternoon. Ellie heard the knock and was in the parlor with her mending when Harlan answered the door, and she heard the change in his voice before she heard the words. He had spoken to her all morning in the measured tone of a capable man managing his world. And when the door opened, that tone compacted itself into something smaller and more controlled, the way a large animal makes itself still when something uncertain comes near. The woman who entered the parlor was not what Ellie had expected. She had expected someone elderly and soft, the kind of community elder who arrived with food and sentiment and the implicit expectation of being welcomed without question. Martha Holt was 68 years old, and she moved like 55, and there was nothing soft about her. She was lean and angular with iron gray hair, pulled severely back, and gray eyes that were very clear and very still, and she wore the kind of expression that comes from decades of being the person in a room that other people watch before deciding how to feel about a situation. She looked at Ellie the way a surveyor looks at a piece of land. "The new bride," she said, not a greeting, a categorization. "Miss Hayes," Ellie replied with equal precision. "Not yet a bride." Something moved at the back of Martha Holt's eyes. Recalibration, perhaps, or simple calculation. She placed a wicker basket on the side table and produced from it a small ceramic jar sealed with wax, a folded linen square, and a paper packet of dried herbs. "A welcoming gift," she said. "It is a tradition here. Tea for the new woman of the house. Good for settling nerves after a long journey." She smiled, and the smile was perfectly calibrated, warm without being effusive. "We have done it this way for a very long time." Harlan, standing in the doorway, said nothing. He watched the ceramic jar the way a man watches something he has seen before and has not decided how to stop seeing. Ellie accepted the jar with both hands and tilted it slightly as she thanked Martha Holt, making a show of examining the workmanship. The wax seal was fresh. The cloth wrapping was fragrant. She breathed in slowly and carefully through her nose, cataloging the layers the way she had learned to do with any unfamiliar thing. Lavender, yes. Something green and slightly bitter that might have been dried wort. And beneath those, so far beneath that she would have missed it if she had not been paying close attention, a sweetness that was not quite any of the herbs she could identify. Faint, almost nothing. She had smelled it before. St. Mary's Charity Hospital, Boston. The winter she had been 14 and had accompanied one of the older girls from St. Catherine's who had needed surgery. She had sat in the hallway for 6 hours, and a nurse had come out at some point and spoken to a physician in the clipped shorthand of medical professionals already administered should sleep until morning. And the smell in the hallway drifting from the open ward had been exactly this, sweet and underneath everything else, laudanum, or something very close to it. "Thank you," Ellie said. She smiled at Martha Holt with the same warmth the woman had offered her. "I will have it this evening. It has been a very tiring few weeks." Martha Holt nodded, satisfied, and spent another 20 minutes exchanging pleasantries about the weather and the state of the road and the approaching first snow, and then she left. When the door closed, Harlan turned from the window where he had been standing and looked at the jar in Ellie's hands. "Traditional welcome," he said as though confirming it. So she said. Ellie set the chair on the side table with the same care she would have given a lit match. "I will be sure to make time for it." She did not make time for it. When no one was watching, she poured the contents into the garden bed beneath the east parlor window, washed the jar, refilled it with plain water and a packet of her own chamomile, and replaced the wax seal as closely as she could manage. Then she went upstairs and added to her notepad, sedative compound found in welcome tea, disguised with lavender and bitter herbs. Martha Holt knew exactly what she was offering. Question: is this administered to every new arrival or specifically to me? Question: what does she need me unaware of? That night, she did not sleep heavily. She slept in the light and provisional way of someone who is not certain that she wants to close her eyes completely. The crying began at 3 in the morning. It was not loud. It would not have woken someone who slept deeply, which was perhaps the point. Ellie was already awake, lying still in her dark room with her eyes on the ceiling when the sound reached her. Thin and muffled, coming from outside, carried on the cold air through the window she had left cracked open precisely in case there was anything outside worth hearing. A woman's voice, not an animal. The quality of human distress is unmistakable once you have heard it enough times, and Ellie had grown up in a building full of children who cried in the night. This was not a child. This was a woman, and she was trying not to be heard. The barn. Ellie lay still and listened. After perhaps 10 minutes, she heard movement inside the house. Rose's room was on the ground floor toward the back. She heard his door, then the back entrance, opening and closing quietly, and through her east-facing window, she saw the soft swing of a lantern crossing the yard to the barn. The crying stopped almost immediately after the barn door closed. 10 minutes later, the barn door opened again. The lantern swung back to the house. Rose's door. Silence. Ellie sat up and reached for her notepad. She wrote "woman in the barn," crying at 3 a.m. Rose knew, went to silence her, not to help her. Barn has a new lock. The household expense ledger shows a line item for domestic staff Nora Finch board and provisions. No corresponding wage. A person with a wage can choose to leave. A person given only board and provisions is dependent on the provider's goodwill to survive. She closed the notepad and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about a woman crying in a barn at 3 in the morning and a man going to quiet her rather than comfort her, and about the new lock on the barn door, and about Ren Brennan, who had passed away 2 years ago in a manner that Jasper Calloway had not settled on a word for yet. The next morning, she found Jasper alone at the forge behind the main house, shaping a piece of iron with the focused and repetitive rhythm of a man who thinks better when his hands are working. She did not approach the subject slowly. She had decided, lying awake in the dark, that she did not have time for slow approaches. "Who is the woman in the barn?" she said. He set the iron down on the rack and looked at her. He was not surprised. She had noticed by now that Jasper Calloway was rarely surprised, which was the mark of either a very perceptive person or a very prepared one, and she suspected he was both. "Her name is Nora Finch," he said. "She came from Bozeman. She was told she would be working here as a housekeeper. She is 24 years old and expecting a child in approximately 3 months. He turned away and picked up the iron again. "She is not a housekeeper." "Then what is she?" He was quiet for long enough that she almost asked again. Then he said, without looking at her, "Do you want me to explain what happens in this community when a man of standing gets married? Or do you need me to start further back than that?" "Start at the beginning," she said. "I will tell you when I have enough." He told her. He was methodical about it. He sat down on a low bench near the forge and folded his hands and spoke the way someone speaks when they have rehearsed a thing so many times in their own mind that the words come out clean and flat, stripped of the emotion that is still very much present beneath them. He told her about the tradition called the welcoming. He told her what it required and who administered it and how it had operated for 50 years in the isolated community that surrounded the Calloway Ranch. He told her how many times he believed it had been performed. He told her how he had begun keeping records at 19 years old and what those records contained and why he had never been able to do anything effective with them alone. Ellie listened. She did not interrupt. She did not write anything down because she had learned long ago that the act of taking notes while someone is speaking can cause them to slow down or edit themselves, and she needed all of it. When he stopped, she said, "The graves on the eastern slope. There are 7. He looked at her very steadily. "Yes. And Nora Finch is intended to be the next." His jaw tightened. "The wedding is scheduled for the 28th of October. The ritual happens the night before." 27 days. It was 27 days to the 28th of October, which meant she had arrived at the right time for everything except doing nothing. He reached into his vest and produced a leather-bound notebook worn soft with years of handling and placed it on the bench between them. She picked it up and opened it. The first pages were dense with dates and careful observations, 6 years of recorded pattern in a compact and precise hand. She turned to the last page. There was one entry on it written not as a record, but as a question addressed to himself, the way a man writes something he cannot yet answer but does not want to lose. Who put the note inside Harlan's letter? The person knew the bride was coming. The person wanted to warn her away. Why warn her but not stop the letter from being sent at all? She looked up from the page. "You wrote it." He did not deny it. "I thought a warning would be sufficient to turn someone back. I thought a sensible person would not come to a place she had been told was dangerous." "I am not entirely sensible," she said. "No," he said. "You are not. I misjudged what sensible looked like." She closed the notebook and placed it between them. "Your brother Roe," she said, "he knows. He helped arrange for Nora Finch to be brought here. He believed it was the lesser harm." Jasper's voice did not change when he said this. It was the voice of someone who had thought about this particular fact for a long time and had reached the end of what thinking could do with it. He was wrong, but he believed it. And Harlan, a pause. "Harlan has his own reasons for what he did. I expect he will tell you himself when he is ready." He looked down at his hands. He usually waits too long. She thought about the household ledger with Nora Finch's name in it and no corresponding wage. She thought about the new lock on the barn door. She thought about the 3 words scratched into a silver hairbrush under a loose floorboard. She thought about Martha Holt's tea with its carefully hidden sedative and the jar she had poured into the garden. "I need 3 things," she said. "I need to see the eastern slope with my own eyes. I need to get inside a room I believe exists in Martha Holt's farmhouse. And I need to find whatever Adeline Calloway left behind when she died." Jasper looked up. His expression was one she would come to know well over the days that followed. It was the expression of a man who has been working alone on a problem for so long that the arrival of a capable partner registers as something almost physical. "Those are the same 3 things I have been trying to accomplish for 6 years," he said. "Then we have lost enough time," she said. "What do we start with?" She visited the village of Calloway Mountain on the 9th day after her arrival. She went with Jasper on the pretext of collecting a supply order from the general store, and she used the 40 minutes they spent there to observe how the community operated and how it received her. What she saw on the faces of the people she met was not what she had expected. She had expected curiosity or the mild suspicion that small communities sometimes direct at outsiders. What she found instead was something that took her most of the morning to name correctly. It was pity. Not the pity of people who looked down on her. The pity of people who looked at her and were reminded of something they had seen before and could not help being reminded of when they saw her again. It was the pity of people who knew how a story ended and were watching it begin. Aldous Wheeler was the last person she spoke to in the village. He came out of the community building that served as his office and greeted her with the practiced warmth of a man who had been managing people's perceptions for many years. He was 55 broad through the chest, silver-haired, and equipped with a handshake precisely calibrated to convey solid respectability without aggression. His eyes were the eyes of an accountant, which Ellie recognized because she had spent 6 years as one, and what they were doing was not greeting her, but processing her. The wedding day is the 28th, he said at some point in the conversation, with the same tone he might use to note that a payment was due. The community looks forward to celebrating with the Calloway family in the traditional manner. He smiled. We take our traditions seriously here. So I understand, she said. Orson Reed was an old man who lived at the edge of the village in a cabin that was barely more than four walls and a stove. He had been a trapper, and before that a scout, and before that something she did not ask about, and he was the only person in Calloway Mountain who had not been born into the community and who had also chosen to stay. Jasper had mentioned him once in passing as the man he trusted most on the mountain, and when she asked him to stop the wagon on the way back to the ranch so she could walk over to the cabin and see if the old man needed anything. Jasper looked at her in a way that suggested he understood exactly what she was doing. Orson Reed was awake. He was lying on his narrow bed with his eyes on the ceiling and his hands folded on his chest like a man who had made his peace with most things and was working on the remainder. He turned his head when she came in. His eyes were clouded with age, but they moved with full intelligence. And when they found her face, they stayed there with an intensity that made her stand still. His hand came up. She took it. His grip was stronger than it had any right to be. 7 brides, he said. His voice was barely more than a rasp, the voice of a man who had been saving his breath for something important. 7 brides came to this mountain. His eyes did not leave her face. 6 of them sleep under the eastern slope. She held his hand and kept her voice level. What are their names? He closed his eyes. He did not answer. He lay still for so long that she thought he had gone to sleep. And then she saw his lips moving slightly, not with words, but with something that might have been a count or a prayer. When she finally took her hand back, his grip had gone slack, and his breathing had the slow and distant rhythm of a man very far from waking. She walked back to the wagon where Jasper was waiting. She climbed up. She looked straight ahead at the road that led back through the trees to the Calloway Ranch. He said 7 brides, she told Jasper. 6 under the eastern slope. Yes, Jasper said quietly. He did not tell me their names. He does not know all of them. He kept his eyes on the horses. That is one of the things I have spent 6 years trying to find. She opened her notepad. She looked at the blank page. Then she wrote, 6 women confirmed eastern slope. Elmore Cooper has been counting for years. He counted me. He knows what the 28th means. He tried to warn me. The names of the women under that slope are not in any official record. They were brought here the same way Nora Finch was brought here from a distance without family, and when they were gone, there was no one to ask where they had gone. She paused with her pencil on the page. She wrote what happened to Ren Brennan. The wagon moved through the trees toward the mountain ranch, and above them the sky was the particular blue of October at elevation deep and clear and cold. And somewhere behind them in the village, Aldous Wheeler was in his community building, thinking about traditions and the 28th of October, and the new woman who had come from Boston who asked too many questions and poured her welcome tea into the garden. 19 days. She turned to the next page in her notepad and started writing what she needed to do first. The forest received them in silence. Ellie and Jasper left the ranch at first light on the 10th day of October, carrying the reasonable excuse of collecting fallen timber from the east pasture edge. The morning was cold enough to see their breath. The horses were left at the fence line. They went the rest of the way on foot, moving through the tall grass at the pasture's edge, and then through the first row of pines where the light changed immediately, dropping from the open gold of early morning into the filtered gray of a place that the sun visited briefly and at an angle. Jasper carried a small lantern, even though they did not need it for light. He carried it the way someone carries a tool they know they will need eventually. The eastern slope was not marked. There was no path leading to it, no fence around it, no arrangement of stones that would tell a stranger what it was. What there was when you knew to look for it was a pattern in the ground that had nothing to do with the natural way of a forest floor. The earth in 7 places was subtly different from the earth around it, the grass shorter, and of a slightly different shade, the soil denser and more settled in a way that came from having been disturbed and then undisturbed for different lengths of time. The oldest of the 7 lay under a young pine that was not quite young anymore. The tree had had years to establish itself above that particular patch of ground. The newest 2 were still visible in the way of things that happened within the last 2 years, the soil still working itself back toward level. Ellie walked the 7 positions and measured with her eye and said nothing. She knelt beside the newest of them and pressed her fingers into the earth and felt the way the soil gave still loose at depth in the way of ground that had been opened and closed again within living memory. Near the base of the 3rd position from the north, half covered by a creep of dead pine needles and the compressed debris of multiple winters, Ellie's fingers found something that was not soil and not root. She brushed away the layer of needles with the flat of her hand, a piece of dark fabric, coarse and stiff with age, partially buried. She lifted it carefully. Beneath it, tilted and cracked from the freeze and thaw of many winters, but still recognizably intact, was a small piece of pottery. A lid from something. Brown clay unglazed about the size of a palm. Plain on the outside except for a single mark pressed into the clay before firing a line with a curve above it, like a simplified figure, like a symbol that carried meaning to whoever made it. She turned it over in her hands. She looked at Jasper. He came and looked at it without touching it. His expression was controlled, but his hands holding the lantern were very still. "I have never come close enough to find anything," he said. "I always knew approximately where they were. I could never bring myself to go further than approximately." She understood that. She also understood that she did not have the luxury of the distance that respect requires. She placed the pottery piece in the cloth bag she had brought for samples and covered the depression she had created as carefully as she could manage. She walked all 7 positions and noted what she could observe without excavating, which was enough to establish that these were not natural formations and not accidental, and that they had been created at intervals over decades by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. 7. She stood in the middle of the 7 positions for a moment with the cold forest around her and the pine smell and the silence. She was not the kind of woman who needed silence to think, but she allowed herself this silence because she thought it was owed. Then she walked back to the fence line where the horses were waiting, and she opened her notepad and wrote down everything she had observed, and then she wrote 22 victims minimum if the oldest positions predate the tree above them. Must confirm dates. The pottery fragment is ritual. This was not accidental disposal. This was ceremony. Someone believed in what they were doing enough to give it the form of ceremony. She looked at the word ceremony for a moment. Then she wrote beneath it, "That is the most dangerous kind of wrong, the kind that comes wrapped in belief." 13 days into October, Harlan and Rowe rode out before dawn to repair a section of fence that the first autumn storm had brought down on the north pasture a full day's work. The house was empty except for Ellie and Jasper and whatever sounds the old timber made as the morning warmed. The hope chest belonging to Adeline Calloway, the brother's mother, was kept in the small storage room at the end of the second-floor hallway. The door was not locked. The chest inside it was solid oak and darkened with age, secured by a simple brass latch that was not a lock, just a latch, the kind that keeps a lid closed rather than keeps a person out. Ellie and Jasper stood in the doorway together for a moment, and then she looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything, and they went in. The chest contained a folded winter dress in navy wool, careful and preserved, a Bible with a cracked spine from years of use, a bundle of letters tied with pale ribbon, the ribbon so old that the color had faded to something between gray and the memory of blue, a small carved wooden horse that had belonged to one of the boys when he was young, and at the bottom, beneath everything else, a thick lining of black velvet. Ellie pressed the four corners of the velvet in turn methodically, the way a doctor presses for what should not be there. The third corner gave. She looked at Jasper. He held the lamp lower. She lifted the velvet panel and set it aside. What she found underneath was not a journal. She had hoped for a journal. What she found was the evidence of something that had been destroyed and almost entirely succeeded at being destroyed. A layer of ash, fine and gray, the remains of a stack of paper that had been burned down to nothing and then carefully preserved even as ash inside the box, as though the ash itself were worth keeping, as though even the remains of words were better than no words at all. And at one corner of the ash, tucked against the wooden wall of the false bottom, where the fire had not been able to reach it completely, was a fragment of paper roughly the size of 3 fingers. One side of it was scorched to illegibility at the edge. The surviving lines of writing were in a woman's hand, careful and small, and formed with the precision of someone who had written to be read and understood, not merely to express herself. Ellie brought the paper close to the lamp. The words that survived read, "The seventh bride will be the last if someone is brave enough to." The sentence ended at the scorched edge. She turned the paper over. On the back, in the same hand, but with less certainty, the pen pressed lighter and the letters slightly larger, as though written by a hand that was unsteady or tired, or both, were 2 more lines. "I tried to be brave enough. I was not. Forgive me." Below that, 2 letters, A.C. Adeline Calloway. Jasper made a sound that was not quite a word. He stepped back from the lamp and stood with his back to the wall of the storage room, and Ellie let him have the silence he needed for a moment before she carefully replaced the paper in the corner of the false bottom, relaid the velvet, and closed the chest as she had found it. She kept nothing. She did not need to. She had already committed every word to memory, and when she went to her desk that evening, she wrote them down exactly as they appeared, the front of the fragment and the back, and then she sat with her pencil motionless above the page and thought about a woman who had known the truth and tried to do something about it and had not been able to, and who had burned her own evidence rather than let it be used against her, and who had kept the ash anyway. "Forgive me." Jasper found her in the kitchen the following morning before the others were up. He came in from outside with the cold still on his coat, and he poured himself coffee and stood at the window and looked at the mountains, and after a while he said, "6 weeks before you arrived, I sent a letter." She waited. "Not to the territorial governor. I had tried that route before, and it went nowhere." He turned from the window. "I sent it to the office of the United States Marshal in Helena. I described what I knew, what I had recorded over 6 years, and I requested a formal investigation. I sent it through Orson Reed, who took it down the mountain by hand and posted it from the town below." He looked at a coffee cup. "I have not received a reply. It is possible the letter was intercepted. It is possible they did not believe it. It is possible a marshal is already on his way and has simply not yet arrived. Ellie calculated the weeks. If the letter had gone out in the last days of August or the first days of September, a reply or a visit could come anywhere in a window of 6 to 8 weeks. The 28th of October was still 19 days away when she made this calculation. We proceed as though no one is coming, she said. If someone arrives, we will have more than we need. If no one arrives, we will still have what we need. He nodded. This was the kind of reasoning he could work with. The three things I told you about, she said. The eastern slope, the room in Holt's house, and the hope chest. I have confirmed the first and the third. The second is next. Holt's house will be the most dangerous, he said. Yes, she agreed, which is why it needs to be done properly. On the 15th day of October, Roe came to find her. She was in the parlor reviewing the household accounts which she had been given access to as part of the practical business of becoming the ranch's manager, and which she had been studying not only for their stated purpose, but for the information they contained about the last 4 years of transactions. She heard him in the hallway before he appeared, the particular quality of his footsteps when he was carrying something he intended to put down, and she set her pencil on the desk and waited. He came in and sat across from her. He did not look at her directly at first, which was unusual for a man who generally made direct eye contact a point of policy. He looked at the fireplace instead, and then at the window, and then at her. You know about Nora Finch, he said. Yes. And you know that I was the one who arranged for her to be brought here. Yes. He folded his hands and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, in the posture of a man who has prepared a defense and intends to present it fully. The welcoming was going to happen regardless of what I did or did not do. The community was not going to allow a Callaway wedding to proceed without it. That has been the arrangement for 50 years, and the community controls the road, the water rights, and the economic life of everyone on this mountain, including this ranch. He looked at her squarely. I could not stop it, so I tried to manage it. A woman from Bozeman without family, without connections, someone whose disappearance would raise fewer questions than the women the community might have chosen themselves. I was reducing harm. Ellie set down her pencil and looked at him for a moment. She did not raise her voice. She did not shift in her seat. She began speaking in the calm and deliberate manner of someone reviewing an account that does not balance. Your first argument is that the ritual would have occurred regardless, she said. This is probably true as a prediction. It does not address the question of your responsibility. If I know a man is going to be robbed and I help identify the victim, I am not less responsible for the robbery because it would have happened without me. Roe's jaw tightened. He did not speak. Your second argument is that a woman without family would suffer less loss or cause less disruption than a woman with family. She paused. Nora Finch has a child she is carrying. That child has no say in the family it was born into. You made a decision for an unborn person about whether its life was worth less than the inconvenience of choosing a different victim. She let that sit for a moment. That is not harm reduction. That is the same calculation that has been made on this mountain 21 times before by different people who all believed they were managing something that could not be stopped. The room was quiet enough to hear the fire. The reason the tradition has lasted 50 years, she said, is not because it cannot be stopped. It is because every person who knew about it decided that their particular version of harm reduction was sufficient, that they had done enough by making it slightly less terrible. She looked at him steadily. You are the 22nd person to use that logic, Roe. And you are sitting across from me because somewhere in the part of you that chose to let me know Nora Finch was in that barn, you already know that. Rose stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her and his hands at his sides. She could see the effort it took him not to argue further the physical quality of a man stopping himself from saying something defensive. After a long time, he said, "I cannot undo what I did." "No," she said, "but you can decide what you do next." He did not answer. He left the room. But before he reached the hallway, he stopped with one hand on the door frame, his back still toward her, and said in a voice that was lower and flatter than his usual tone, "If you are going to do something about this, you should know that I will not stand in the way of it." He paused. "That is all I can offer right now." "It is more than nothing," she said. He went out. She sat alone in the parlor for several minutes after he left, looking at the household accounts without seeing them, thinking about the cost of being the person who says the thing that needs to be said in the room where it has never been said before. The days that followed were not dramatic. They were the days of a ranch in October full of physical work and ordinary need, and Ellie moved through them with the patience of someone who has decided on a course of action and is waiting for the right moment to take it. She rode with Harlan to check the north pasture fence. She worked through 3 years of financial records and found what she had been looking for, which was a pattern of expenses that correlated precisely with the dates of community weddings. Small purchases, untraceable without context. Boys, Klaus, with context, a clear record of what the community had been doing with what the community called its traditional resources. She and Harlan did not speak much during those days, but they spoke with more honesty than she had expected. He was not the closed and remote man she had initially assessed. He was a man who had learned to use closeness as protection, which was different. When the work gave them quiet moments together side by side over a fence repair or a grain inventory, she found that he observed things with the same precision she did, and that he chose his words with the same care. He was not comfortable with directness about himself, but he was direct about everything else, and she found that she trusted the everything else. On the 18th day of October, Ellie accepted an invitation to visit Martha Holt's farmhouse. The invitation came through Lavinia Wheeler, who arrived at the ranch in a light buggy to accompany Ellie to what she described as a traditional preparation meeting for the bride and informal gathering of the elder women of the community. Ellie accepted with the composure of someone who had been planning for exactly this opportunity and had been waiting for it to arrange itself on terms that would not create immediate suspicion. Martha Holt's farmhouse was older than the Callaway main house, by at least 2 decades low and solid and built from the stone of the mountain itself, the spaces between the stones mortared in a style that Ellie did not recognize and suspected had come from somewhere far from Montana. The interior smelled of dried plants and wood smoke and something sweet and faintly metallic that she had learned to recognize. Martha herself was composed and gracious in the particular way of people who are entirely comfortable with the power they hold. The women talked for an hour about weather and provisions and the schedule of the coming week. Ellie listened and asked questions that appeared harmless and were not. She learned the daily pattern of the farmhouse, who came and went, when Martha typically went out to her garden, and when she received visitors, and when the house was likely to be empty. She also used the visit to ask to use the facilities at the back of the house. She did not go to the facilities at the back of the house. She went out and walked around the north wall of the farmhouse with a particular kind of attention, the attention of someone who has studied the interior layout of a building and is now comparing what she observed with what she can see from outside. The north wall was stone unbroken, no windows. At floor level, where the foundation met the earth, the ground was slightly softer, slightly warmer in the way of earth above a space that holds heat. She placed her hand flat against the stone. Through the stone barely perceptible, the slow vibration of a lamp burning in an enclosed space. She walked back around to the door. Inside, when she returned, she allowed her eyes to sweep the far wall of the main room one more time. The large wooden shelving unit that covered the north wall held jars and packets and the tools of a woman who had been working with plants for 50 years. It was a practical arrangement, entirely functional. And at the very bottom right corner of the lowest shelf, where the edge of the unit met the wall, there was a gap of perhaps a quarter inch between the shelf frame and the stone, and through that gap, almost nothing, just the faintest suggestion of warmth and the smell that was not the smell of the herbs on the shelves above. She drank her tea, the ordinary tea this time, and she thanked Martha Holt for the afternoon, and she rode back to the ranch with Lavinia Wheeler making conversation beside her. And she said nothing about any of it until she was in her room with the door closed and her notepad open. She wrote room behind the north shelf, access from inside, lamp burning or recently burning. The smell is the same as the sedative tea. Whatever is kept there is active, not archived. I need access when the house is empty. The following evening, on the 19th day, Harlan came to find her. He came to the parlor after supper when Roe had gone to the barn, and Jasper was in the kitchen, and he stood in the parlor doorway with the look of a man who has decided to say something and is making sure he says it correctly. I need to tell you something about why I sent that letter, he said. The advertisement, the letter to Boston. She set down her mending. He came in and sat down, not across from her, but beside her at the other end of the settee, looking at the middle distance between them, rather than at her directly. He was quiet for long enough that she understood this was not hesitation, but preparation, the silence of someone who has decided to tell the whole truth and is making sure he knows where it begins. He told her about Ren Brennan first. He told her about the night that he had understood what the welcoming was and what it required that he had been told, in the blunt terms that the community uses for things it considers matter of fact, and that he had been told it was his responsibility as the eldest Calloway to ensure it proceeded. He told her that he had not stopped it. He told her what Ren Brennan had been like, not in the sentimental terms of a man remembering a woman he had loved, but in the precise terms of a man who had watched someone be damaged irreparably and was describing the damage so that the record was accurate. She had been strong and quiet and practical and had arrived on the mountain with the same steady intention that Ellie had arrived with. And she had left it diminished in ways that had nothing to do with the physical and everything to do with the particular kind of destruction that happens to a person who witnesses a terrible thing and is made to understand that they have no recourse. She died 8 months after the wedding, he said. The official cause was fever. The actual cause was that she had stopped being interested in surviving. He said this flatly with the flatness of a man who has had 2 years to understand it and has not finished understanding it and knows he will not finish. He was quiet for a moment, then he told her about the advertisement. He told her that he had written it with specific criteria in mind: intelligent, no family, from a large eastern city where a woman's absence would eventually draw official questions rather than just personal ones, capable of independent observation and documentation. The kind of woman whose testimony, if she chose to give it, would carry the weight of an outside witness with no stake in the community's social order. He had needed an outside witness. He had not known how to use one. He had not thought beyond getting one onto the mountain and hoping that the situation would resolve itself in a way that did not require him to be the one to act. I used you, he said, as a strategy, not as a person. Before I knew you." He looked at her finally. "I would not make the same calculation now." The room was quiet, a log in the fireplace settled. Ellie sat with this information the way she sat with all information, turning it over and examining each face of it before speaking. What she felt was not the sharp injury of betrayal, which was the simpler response, but something more complex, the kind of feeling that comes from understanding a person well enough to see both the wrong they have done and the reason they did it, without being able to resolve those two things into a single moral verdict. "You needed help, and you did not know how to ask for it honestly," she said. "That is not an excuse, but it is a description." She looked at the fire. "What you have told me tonight is either the most honest thing you have said since I arrived, or it is a different kind of calculation." She turned to look at him. "Which one is it?" He held her gaze. "Honest." She had spent 3 weeks cataloging every evasion and qualification in the speech of men who would not tell the full truth, and this had none of those qualities. She believed him. "Then we have something to work with," she said. The truth about Adeline Calloway came together on the 20th day of October, in the way that solutions to old problems sometimes come together not through a single revelation, but through the accumulation of small, confirmed facts that reach a point where the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Jasper had known for some time in the uncertain way of someone who suspects something but lacks confirmation that his mother's death had not been entirely natural. What he had not known was the mechanism. What Ellie supplied was the connection between the mechanism and the evidence that had been in the household all along. The tea. She had been keeping notes on Martha Holt's herbal compounds since the first day, cataloging the herbs she could identify and cross-referencing them against the limited medical literature she had access to through the ranch's small library. One of the compounds she had identified in the welcome tea was a plant used in small doses as a sedative and in larger doses over extended periods as an agent of cumulative damage to the respiratory system. Progressive, difficult to distinguish from naturally occurring lung disease. Most effective when introduced through something the recipient consumed voluntarily and regularly, something offered as a kindness. Tea, offered by a trusted neighbor, perhaps offered for years. Adeline Calloway had died in 1869, 4 years after she had, according to the note from Elmore Cooper, that Jasper had in his records attempted to send a letter to the county sheriff describing what she knew. The county sheriff at the time had been Aldous Wheeler's cousin. The letter had not resulted in any investigation. And within the year following the letter, Adeline's health had begun to decline. She had declined for 3 years before she died. She had kept the ash of her burned letters in a box. She had written on a scrap of paper that she had tried to be brave enough and had not been. She had known what was happening to her, and she had known why. And she had not been able to stop it, and she had burned the evidence herself, perhaps hoping that burning it would buy her more time, perhaps already past the point of hope and simply trying to protect her children from whatever would happen to them if the evidence were found and the author of it were still alive. Jasper sat in the kitchen when Ellie laid this out for him. He sat very still and looked at the table and did not move for a long time. Ellie did not offer comfort. She offered the only thing she could give him that was worth anything, which was the clear statement that this changed nothing about what they were going to do and made it more necessary. "She tried," Ellie said, "and she could not do it alone. That is the answer to the question she asked at the end of what she wrote." She looked at him. "The answer to forgive me is we finish what you started." Jasper looked up. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Harlan, when they told him to went outside, he was gone for 20 minutes. When he came back, he stood at the kitchen door and looked at both of them and said, "Tell me what the plan is." The plan was still forming when Aldous Wheeler arrived at the ranch gate on the 21st day of October. He came with 4 men from the community, not armed in any visible way, but present in the particular way of men who are reminding you of their numbers. They stood outside the gate in the cold morning air, while Ellie watched from the parlor window, and Wheeler himself walked to the gate post and called for Harlan with the tone of a man who considers himself entitled to be heard at any hour. Harlan went out to meet him. Ellie watched through the window. She could not hear the words, but she had learned to read the postures of men in conversation from years of watching contracts being negotiated across tables, and what she read was clear enough. Wheeler spoke for some time with the easy authority of someone presenting conditions rather than making requests. Harlan stood with his arms at his sides and his shoulders back, and his weight distributed evenly, which was the stance of a man who has decided something and is not going to be moved by the presentation of conditions. At one point, Wheeler gestured toward the barn. Harlan did not look in that direction. He looked at Wheeler and kept looking at Wheeler and did not follow the gesture. Wheeler spoke again. Harlan's answer was short. Wheeler looked at Harlan for a long moment, the way a man looks at an obstacle. He has not decided whether to go around or through. Then he turned and said something to the men behind him, and they did not leave. They spread slightly the way a group of people spreads when they want to occupy more space than they are formally claiming. Harlan walked back to the house. He came into the parlor and closed the door and looked at Ellie. "He says the welcoming proceeds as planned," Harlan said. "He says the community's traditions are not subject to the personal preferences of one member of one family." "What did you say?" "I told him no." "How did he respond?" "He reminded me that the community controls the water rights to the upper pasture and the road maintenance agreement for the winter months." Ellie looked out the window at the men still standing at the gate. She counted. 4 men plus Wheeler standing in the cold at 8 in the morning to make a point, which meant they had been told to be there before dawn. This was not an improvised response to Harlan's refusal. This had been planned in advance of the refusal, which meant Wheeler had anticipated it, which meant someone had told Wheeler to anticipate it. She filed that information carefully and turned back to Harlan. "He will not use physical force," she said. "Not yet. He needs the community to believe this is a voluntary tradition, not a compelled one. The moment it becomes obviously coercive, some of the people who have been compliant by silence will stop being silent." She looked at him. "He is here to apply pressure, not to act. We have time." "How much time?" 7 days to the 28th. She went to the desk and sat down. "Enough." That was when she began to understand the shape of the problem they had not yet solved. She had been careful from the beginning about which conversations she had within earshot of anyone outside the core of 4 people who knew the plan. She had been careful about which rooms she spoke in and which doors she left open. She had been as thorough as she knew how to be. But on the 22nd day of October, she tested a suspicion she had been developing for 3 days. The test was simple. She mentioned in a conversation with Lavinia Wheeler that occurred when they crossed paths at the general store in the village, a piece of false information. Specific, plausible. The kind of detail that would be useful to someone who was monitoring the Calloway household's intentions. She told Lavinia Wheeler in the middle of an apparently casual exchange about the expected first snow that she and Harlan planned to move Nora Finch to Orson Reed's cabin on the night of the 24th. That evening, Rowe reported that Aldous Wheeler had sent a man to watch Orson Reed's road. Not the main road, Reed's road, the specific lesser-known access point. Ellie sat with this for an hour before she told the others. She sat with it because the implication required a recalibration of the security around their planning, and she wanted to be certain before she recalibrated it. The implication was this: Lavinia Wheeler was the channel through which the ranch's plans were reaching Aldous Wheeler. And Rowe, who had spoken to Lavinia more than anyone else in recent days, had not been reporting to Wheeler intentionally. He had simply not understood that Lavinia was listening with a purpose. She told Rowe this directly and without accusation because he deserved directness and had earned the right to be told accurately rather than gently. He took it the way she had come to expect from him, with the quiet and concentrated stillness of a man absorbing a blow he has decided not to flinch from. Then he said, "What do you need me to do differently?" "Nothing dramatic," she said. "You continue as normal. But what you tell Lavinia Wheeler from this point forward, I choose. And what you actually know about the plan from this point forward, limited to your specific role in it." He nodded once. It was not comfortable for him. He accepted it anyway, and in that acceptance, there was something that had not been present in the earlier conversation about Nora Finch, a willingness to be subordinate to someone else's judgment, a willingness to trust outside himself. Jasper watched this exchange from across the kitchen table without comment. Later, when Rowe had gone out, he said quietly, "He is trying." "I know," she said. "That matters." She opened her notepad to a fresh page and drew a grid. 7 days, 4 people, 3 objectives still remaining. The secret room in Holt's house, which held the central evidence. Nora Finch, who needed to be out of the barn and off the mountain before the night of the 27th. And the letter to Helena from Jasper, which was either sitting in a drawer in a federal building or in the hands of a marshal who was already moving toward them through the mountains. She could not count on the letter. She could count on herself and on the 3 men who had each in their different ways and at different costs decided which side of this they were on. She wrote until the lamp needed refilling, and when she refilled it, she kept writing, and outside the window the mountain was dark, and the eastern slope was dark inside it, and the 7 positions were dark in the slope, and under the cold October ground, the women whose names had never been spoken aloud in any legal proceeding lay in the silence that had been kept over them for decades. She wrote their names, the ones she had in the margin of the page, small and careful, each one with a period after it, the way you finish a sentence that deserves to be finished properly. Then she turned back to the center of the page and kept planning. The plan, as Ellie explained it on the evening of October 27th, was organized around a single governing principle. Every person who knew about it knew only their own piece. Rowe knew that he was to go to the north pasture before midnight, check the fence line on the western edge, and return by the path that ran close to the community road. This was a real task and a reasonable one. It also meant that any information Rowe held, if it reached Aldous Wheeler through Lavinia or any other channel, would be accurate information about a fence inspection and nothing more. Jasper knew the barn, the path behind it, the route through the lower pasture to the tree line, and the 2-mile walk through the pines to Orson Reed's cabin on the north slope. He had walked it 3 times in the past week, twice in daylight and once in the dark, until he knew it by the feel of the ground and the sound of the wind through the specific stands of timber at each turning point. He knew that Nora Finch needed to leave the barn at a moment when the community's watchers, who had been posted at intervals along the main road since Wheeler's visit, were focused on the road and not on the far pasture edge. He also knew that Ellie would not be with him when he did this, and that if something went wrong, he was to take Nora to Reed and wait regardless of what that waiting required of him. Harlan knew that he was the visible piece. He was to remain at the ranch house with lights burning and movement in the windows and the ordinary sounds of a household that had not yet done anything that warranted watching, while the parts of the plan that required darkness and stillness happened elsewhere. Ellie knew all of it. She left the ranch at 9 in the evening through the kitchen garden, which had a low gate at the back that opened into the stand of willows running along the creek. And from there, she went east through the willows until she was out of sight of both the ranch house and the community road. And then she turned south and moved through the open ground between the creek and the first tree line at a pace that was neither hurried nor casual, the pace of someone going somewhere they intended to arrive at. Martha Holt's farmhouse was dark by 10, except for the front parlor where a single lamp burned behind the heavy curtains. Ellie watched from the tree line for 20 minutes. She identified the movement inside two figures, one that moved with the deliberate slowness of age, and one that moved with Lavinia Wheeler's characteristic, purposeful efficiency. They were in the parlor, and they were there for the evening. She went around the west side of the house through the garden beds, moving along the wall, where the ground was softest and her footsteps made the least sound. The west window over the scullery had a latch that she had assessed during her afternoon visit as the kind of latch that served its function unless someone applied specific pressure at the left corner of the frame, at which point the latch pin cleared its catch and the window opened inward. She applied specific pressure at the left corner. The window opened. Inside, the scullery smelled of dried herbs and cold ash from the small stove. She stood completely still for 30 seconds, long enough to be certain that the sounds of the house had not changed. The low voices from the parlor continued without interruption. She moved through the scullery doorway into the hall and down the hall to the north wall. The shelf unit was exactly as she had observed it. She found the lowest right corner in the dark by memory and touch, and she found the gap between the frame and the stone, and she found the mechanism that Jasper had described to her based on his knowledge of how his grandfather had built hidden storage in the original ranch construction. The same method awaited release point that shifted the entire unit on a vertical pivot rather than swinging it like a door. She pressed the correct point. The shelf moved inward and to the right with the smooth and well-maintained silence of something used regularly. She went in. The room was small and held a lamp that had been recently extinguished, still warm. She did not relight it. She had a small candle in her coat pocket, and she lit that instead, cupping her flame with her palm so that the light was minimal and directional. She had prepared a list in her mind of what she needed in order of evidential weight. She went down the list. On the narrow table, a set of silver implements wrapped individually in black cloth, each one engraved with symbols and dated. She unwrapped each one in turn, examined the dates, rewrapped them, and placed four of the most clearly dated pieces in the cloth bag she carried. She did not take all of them. She took enough. On the shelves along the inner wall, 6 bound notebooks of varying ages. She opened each one at the first and last pages to assess the date range and the content, and she took 3. On the far wall, the one she had come for specifically, a length of white linen stretched taut across a wooden frame, perhaps 3 feet by 2, with writing on it in a careful and deliberate hand. Names organized in columns. She counted them as she read. 21 names, each name accompanied by a date and a second name. The first column was the name of the bride. The second column was the name of the borrowed woman. The third column was the date. She read down the bride column until she reached the bottom. Eleanor Hayes, October 28, 1873. The borrowed woman column beside her name was blank, and beneath her name, added in a different medium from the ink that recorded all the other entries in pencil in smaller and less certain letters. Not this one. She stood looking at those 3 words for longer than she had planned to stand still in this room. Then she took the knife she carried for field work, cut the linen from the frame along the edge with 4 careful strokes, rolled it tightly, and placed it inside her coat. She was replacing the empty frame against the wall when she heard Wheeler's voice, not from the parlor, from outside at the front of the house. He was speaking to someone in the low and businesslike tone of a man discussing a logistical matter, and what she heard through the stone of the wall and the wood of the frame was enough. The eastern slope, before dawn, enough men to move what needed to be moved. No traces by morning. She was out of the secret room and through the shelf and down the hall and out the scullery window in less than 2 minutes. And she was running through the garden and along the west wall toward the tree line before she had finished processing everything she had just heard. Wheeler was not going to wait for the welcoming. He had understood either through Lavinia's reports or through his own calculation that the ritual was not going to proceed as planned. He had moved to the contingency that eliminated the need for the ritual entirely, which was to destroy the evidence that made the ritual dangerous to him. Without the graves on the eastern slope, without the physical confirmation of what the community had been doing, there was no case that a territorial court could bring. The notebooks and the linen cloth that Ellie carried would constitute a claim. Without corroborating physical evidence, a claim from a mail-order bride who had been on the mountain for less than a month would be defensible. He was going to dig up the eastern slope tonight. She changed direction and ran northeast. Harlan was at the fence line before she reached the pasture edge, which meant he had seen the movement at the farmhouse from the high window and understood it without being told. He fell into step beside her without speaking, and they covered the distance to the eastern tree line in the controlled run of people who need to arrive both quickly and with some degree of capability remaining. What they found at the eastern slope was a lantern and 4 men with shovels and Aldous Wheeler standing at the perimeter of the 7 positions the other 4 he had originally brought to the ranch gate left to watch the main road. He stood watching his men work with the expression of a man supervising an ordinary task. They had been at it for perhaps 20 minutes. The 2 newest of the 7 positions had been disturbed. The earth moved aside into rough piles. The men had not yet reached anything significant in either location, but at the pace they were working, they would within the hour. Harlan stopped at the edge of the lamp glow. Whistler looked up. The 2 men looked at each other for a moment in the particular way of men who have known each other a long time and are now standing on opposite sides of a line they both understand. "You're destroying evidence in a federal matter," Harlan said. He said it with the same tone he used to describe fence conditions and water yields, flat and precise, and carrying the weight of complete seriousness under its surface. Wheeler smiled, which was not the response Harlan's tone generally produced in people. "There is no federal matter, Calloway. There are traditions that a community has practiced for 50 years that you have recently developed inconvenient opinions about." He looked at the men with shovels. "Keep working." Rowe came out of the trees on the south side of the slope. He had not been at the fence line as planned. He had been somewhere else, and he came out of the dark pines with the contained and deliberate movement of a man who has made a decision about something important and has decided not to take additional time to reconsider it. He walked past Wheeler's 4 men and past Wheeler himself and stood beside Harlan. He did not look at Wheeler when he spoke. He looked at the 2 disturbed positions on the eastern slope. "I know the names of the women in those 2 places," he said. "I know them because I read Jasper's records. Harriet Sloan from Miles City, 1870. Hester Bishop from Billings, 1868. He paused. "I arranged for Nora Finch to come here. I am prepared to testify to that in any court that has jurisdiction." He looked at Wheeler then. "Put the shovels down." Wheeler's expression changed. Not in the direction of fear, not yet, but in the direction of a man recalculating the dimensions of a problem he had assessed as manageable. The shovels did not go down. Wheeler looked at his four men and gave a single nod, and the men set down the shovels and spread out from the lamp perimeter in a way that suggested they had other tools available to them if needed, the kind of tools that men on a mountain in 1873 could carry without drawing particular attention to themselves. Harlan shifted his weight slightly, and then someone came out of the trees on the north side of the slope, alone without a lamp, using instead the pale ambient light of a clear October sky and the long familiarity of someone who knew this particular piece of ground in the dark. Martha Holt moved slowly because she was 68 years old and the ground was uneven, but she moved with a certainty that had nothing to do with speed. She carried nothing except a small, cloth-wrapped object held against her chest with both hands, the way someone carries something they have been holding for a very long time and have finally decided to put down. Wheeler looked at her, and for the first time Ellie saw in his face something she had not seen there before. Not fear exactly, something older than fear. The look of a man whose last ally has just walked to the other side of the line. Martha Holt stopped at the edge of the lamplight and looked at Ellie. She held out the cloth-wrapped object. Ellie took it. Inside the cloth was a small notebook bound in leather so old and handled that the leather had gone soft and dark in the center where hands had held it most. Ellie opened it. The handwriting inside was Martha Holt's, the same careful hand she had seen in the notebooks from the secret room, but older, the earlier pages written in a younger version of the same hand. The later pages progressively more deliberate as the years had made the hand more careful. 21 names, one per page. For each name, full name as known, date of birth, if known, place of origin, the name of the father or husband or whoever had been the closest family connection. For the women for whom she had only a first name, she had written the first name and then everything else she had known, what she looked like, where she had come from, what season it had been, what the weather had been on the specific night. She had been keeping this for 40 years. Wheeler said, Martha. Martha Holt looked at the rolled linen tucked inside Ellie's coat. The note in pencil at the bottom of the list, she said, under your name. I wrote that the night you arrived when I saw that someone was already asking questions that no one in this community asks. A pause. In 40 years, I never once wrote anything on that cloth that was not a record. Your name was the first time I wrote something that was not. She turned to face Wheeler. I am done, she said. Two words said with the finality of something that has been decided at great cost and over a great length of time and is now simply fact. Ellie looked at the old woman standing in the lamplight at the edge of the slope, where 7 of the 21 women whose names were in the book lay beneath the ground. She looked at the face of a woman who had spent 40 years doing the thing she had been made to do after surviving, the thing that was supposed to have killed her, and she thought about the pencil marks under her own name on the tally cloth and the 3 words that had kept her alive without her knowing it. Tell me, Ellie said. Martha Holt told her. She told her in the flat and factual way of someone who has rehearsed the account enough times that the emotion in it has been worn smooth like a stone in water. She told her that in 1835, she had been 19 years old and had come to Callaway Mountain from Glasgow by way of Halifax, by way of a bad marriage, and worse luck in that a woman named Edith Crail had offered her work and brought her here, and that she had understood what was intended for her too late to do anything about it. She told her that the keeper in 1835 had been a woman named Una Graves, who was by that time very old and had performed the ritual 11 times and believed in it with the full conviction of a person who has never been given any reason to doubt what they were taught, but who had also in 40 years of absolute power developed the particular mercy that can grow in powerful people when they are old enough and tired enough and have seen enough pain to allow it. Una Graves had performed the ceremony with the borrowed woman and had administered what she was supposed to administer, and then had made a choice that no keeper had made before her. She had administered the antidote that she had developed and never used the one she had kept as a private secret against a day she had always told herself would never come. Martha Holt had survived. The community had not known what to do with a borrowed woman who survived. There was no tradition for it. There was no precedent. And Una Graves, dying herself within the year, had proposed a solution that the community accepted because it resolved the problem without requiring anyone to think about what the problem actually was. The survivor would become the next keeper. I was 19 years old, Martha said. I had nowhere to go. I had no one who would have believed me or helped me, and the community knew it. She paused. So I became Una Graves. The forest was quiet around them. The lamp burned and made the circle of faces visible and made everything outside the circle very dark. 21 times, Ellie said. I know, Martha said. She did not say anything else. She did not have anything else to say that would be worth saying, and she understood that, and she let the silence carry the rest. The fifth voice came from the tree point on the eastern side of the slope, which was the direction no one had been watching. Aldous Wheeler, I am United States Marshal Rennick Hart, operating under a warrant issued by the Office of the Territorial Governor of Montana. I am asking you to remain where you are. He came out of the trees with two men behind him, both carrying lamps of the larger variety that federal officers used when they needed their authority to be visible at a distance. Hart himself was a compact and unhurried man of about 48, with the quality of someone who made a habit of arriving at the precise moment that events required rather than the moment that circumstances allowed. He moved across the slope with the easy authority of a man who had spent 30 years being the person who stepped into situations that other people had made complicated and then being the person who made them simple again. He had arrived at Orson Reed's cabin on the afternoon of October 26th. He had spent a day and a half observing before he acted because the letter from Jasper Calloway had been specific enough and credible enough to warrant caution, but not so documented that he could walk in with a warrant and arrest anyone on the strength of it alone. He needed to see the thing he was arresting people for. He had seen enough tonight. He looked at Ellie with the appraising attention of someone who has been briefed on a person and is confirming that the briefing was accurate. Then he looked at the cloth bag she carried and the rolled linen inside her coat and the small notebook in her hands. You've been busy, he said. The eastern slope, she said. 7 confirmed positions. I have physical evidence from 3 of them in the bag recovered before the ground was disturbed. The notebooks document the practice over 50 years. The linen cloth is a formal record maintained by the keeper. She paused. This woman is Martha Holt. She is the keeper, and she is prepared to give a full account. Hart looked at Martha Holt for a moment. He looked at the notebook in Ellie's hands. He looked at Wheeler, who had gone very still in the way of a man who has run the available calculations and found none of them satisfactory. Mr. Wheeler, Hart said, I am going to need you to come with me. Wheeler did not move immediately. He looked around the lamp-lit circle one more time at Harlan and Rose standing together, and Ellie with the evidence in her hands, and Martha Holt with her hands empty at her sides, and his 4 men who were no longer spreading out, but standing in place with the specific quality of men who have assessed the situation and decided that their employer's problem is not their problem. He looked at all of this, and then he looked at Hart and the 2 federal men with their large lamps. You have the word of a mail-order bride who has been here a month, he said. I have 21 names in a handwritten record, Hart said. I have physical evidence recovered from burial positions on the eastern slope of this property. I have the testimony of the man who maintained a 6-year record of the practice. I have the testimony of a member of the Calloway family who personally arranged the transportation of a victim. And I have the keeper herself." He paused. "I have enough." Aldous Wheeler came with him. His 4 men did not resist, which was what Ellie had predicted, and what the calculations of self-preservation generally produce in men who were following orders rather than believing in something. Martha Holt sat down on the ground where she stood. Not from weakness, though she was 68 and had walked through dark pines to get to this particular place at this particular hour. She sat down because she was done standing. Harlan went to her and crouched beside her and asked her if she was all right, and she looked at him with the gray eyes that had always seen more than they let on, and said that she had not been all right for 40 years and that she was not sure what all right felt like, but that she thought she might have some time to find out. Harlan put his hand on her arm very briefly and then stood up, and he looked across the slope at Ellie, and what passed between them in that look was not the articulate kind of communication, but the older kind, the kind that has nothing to do with words and everything to do with two people who have been through the same night together and are standing in the aftermath of it and finding each other still there. Jasper arrived at Orson Reed's cabin with Nora Finch at 11:30, 20 minutes ahead of the plan. Nora had walked the 2 miles through the dark pines with the determined steadiness of a woman who has been waiting for permission to move, and who, once given it, does not slow down. She had not cried. She had not spoken much. At one point near the second turn in the path where the ground dropped sharply to the left, she had put her hand out and taken Jasper's arm for balance, and he had let her take it, and they had walked the rest of the way like that without comment. Orson Reed had the lamp burning and the stove hot and had made no comment about the hour or the company, which was what Jasper had expected of him, and why he was the only person on the mountain that Jasper had trusted with his reasons. Nora sat down by the stove and looked at the wall for a while. Then she looked at Jasper and said, "What happens next?" He told her as much as he knew. She listened with the focused attention of someone who is planning ahead, not processing what has already happened. "I need the name of whoever authorized my transport to this mountain in writing," she said, "and I need to know who to speak to about the child in terms of legal protection." "Marshall Hart," Jasper said. "He will be here by morning." And she nodded. That was enough. She asked for something to eat, and Orson Reed produced bread and cold venison, and she ate it methodically, and then she leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes, and she did not sleep. But she let herself be still, and Jasper sat on the other side of the stove and kept watch and said nothing, which was the right thing to do and which he knew was the right thing to do. The morning of October 28th arrived with the specific clarity that follows a night that has cost something. The sky was the deep, undisturbed blue of early autumn at elevation, and the mountains to the west were exactly what they had always been: enormous and indifferent and permanent. And the light came down through the pines at the angle that it came down at this time of year, at this latitude, which was the only angle it had ever come down at. Ellie stood at the kitchen window of the Calloway Ranch and drank coffee and watched the yard and thought about the difference between the date as a number, October 28th, and the date as a weight it had been carrying for 27 days. The weight was gone. What remained was work. Rennick Hart worked through the morning with the systematic efficiency of a man who understands that evidence must be assembled in a specific order if it is to survive a courtroom. He took Ellie's account first because she had the widest scope of observation and the clearest documentary record. He went through her notepad entry by entry, asking questions that were precise and evidential, not interested in her impressions, but in what she had seen and when and under what circumstances. She answered in the same terms, and he wrote everything down in the particular handwriting of Federal record-keeping uniform, and legible and designed to be read by strangers a long time later in a different room. He took Rose's account second. Rose sat across from the marshal at the kitchen table and answered every question without qualification, including the questions about his own role and decisions, and he answered them accurately. And when it was over, he looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time and had been allowed to set it down not without cost, but down. He took Jasper's records, all of them 6 years of meticulous notation, and spent an hour with them before saying that this was the most thorough private documentation of a pattern crime he had encountered in 30 years of federal work, and that whoever had compiled it had done so with the instinct of a professional investigator. Jasper said that he had simply written down what he saw. Hart said that most people who saw what he had seen chose not to write it down. Martha Holt gave her account last, and it was the longest by a considerable margin. Hart was thorough and unsparing, and she answered everything he asked without deflection or self-protection. The account of what had happened in 1835 and what had happened in the 40 years following was recorded in the same form as everything else, the uniform handwriting, the precise dates and circumstances. And if the marshal's pen slowed slightly at certain passages and then continued at the same pace, that was the only evidence that the account was anything other than another document in a federal record. When it was over, Martha Holt stood up and thanked him, which was not what anyone had expected, and she walked to the door and said she was going home to her house, and Hart told her she was not to leave the mountain until the investigation was concluded, and she said she understood that, and she walked out into the October morning. She was not at her house when the investigation concluded. She was not on the mountain. She was not found in the weeks that followed, despite the inquiries that Hart made through the standard channels of a federal officer looking for a material witness in a closed community. She was simply not there. The small notebook she had carried was there. The account she had given was recorded. The 21 names were entered into the federal record with as much detail as 40 years of careful attention could provide. Martha Holt was not there. Ellie thought about this for a long time. She thought about what it meant for the legal proceedings, and she thought about what it meant for justice in the specific and formal sense, and she thought about what it meant for the 21 women in the notebook. She did not reach a conclusion that satisfied all of these considerations simultaneously. She was precise enough to recognize that some things do not resolve into satisfactory conclusions, and that the honest response to that was to hold the discomfort of it rather than to manufacture a resolution that was not actually there. She wrote in her notepad, Martha Holt survived a thing that was supposed to kill her and spent 40 years inside it because she did not have anywhere to go. She kept the names for 40 years. She came to the slope at midnight at 68 years old and put the names in my hands. I do not know how to weigh that against 21. I know that I cannot weigh it cleanly. I know that I will not stop trying to weigh it correctly. The winter came down on Callaway Mountain in the last week of October and sealed the road in the second week of November. Hart was already below the snow line before it sealed with Wheeler in custody and Lavinia Wheeler following separately under her own recognizance and with a freight wagon carrying the physical evidence in secured boxes. The winter was long. They were 4 in the house, which was different from the way the house had operated before Ellie's arrival, but not uncomfortably different. The ranch required what it always required in winter, and they met those requirements in the practical and unromantic way of people who understand that survival in the mountains is a collective enterprise. Jasper taught Ellie to track the cattle in snow by sound, which was a skill that required patience and stillness, and which she was better at than either of them had expected. Harlan showed her the structural repairs the barn needed, and they did them together over 3 cold days, working side by side with the methodical ease of people who have learned each other's working rhythms without discussing it. Roe was quieter than he had been before, which was not sullenness, but the quality of a man spending the winter inside the consequences of his decisions and letting the process have the time it required. In the first week of January, carried by a rider who had come up the mountain on the one clear day between storms, a message arrived from the town below. Nora Finch had delivered a son, healthy, born in the warmth of the boarding house room where she had been staying since Hart had arranged her transport down the mountain in the final days of October. She had given him a name. She had written the name in the message herself in the pragmatic and unadorned handwriting that Ellie had learned to recognize from their brief correspondence after the rescue. His name is Amos. He is well. Jasper read the message at the kitchen table and folded it and put it in the pocket of his shirt and went back to whatever he had been doing before, and the house continued as it had been. But that evening, when Ellie came downstairs long after the others had gone to bed, she found him still sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp burning and a blank page in front of him, and she made tea and sat across from him, and they stayed like that for a while without speaking, which had become one of the comfortable arrangements between them. And then she said she thought the name Amos was a good name, solid, and not easily diminished. And he said he agreed, and then they sat in silence again until the lamp needed trimming and they each went upstairs. The trial of Aldous Wheeler took place in Helena in the spring of 1874, in a federal courtroom under the jurisdiction of the Territorial Court, with a judge brought from the district office in Omaha. It was as Rennick Hart had predicted on the night of the arrest, not a simple case. Wheeler's defense had months of winter to prepare in, and it arrived in the courtroom with a strategy that questioned the chain of custody of the physical evidence, challenged the credibility of witnesses who had anything to benefit from Wheeler's conviction, and positioned the entire case as an intrusion by federal authority into the legitimate traditions of a self-governing community. The strategy did not succeed. It did not succeed primarily because of the 21 names in the small leather notebook, with each woman's full history behind her name, and because the notation in that record corresponded precisely with the records in the 3 notebooks from the secret room, and because the physical evidence from the eastern slope included, among other items, the piece of dated pottery Ellie had recovered in October, and 3 similar pieces that Hart's team had documented at the other positions, which established the ritual nature of the burials in a way that could not be attributed to coincidence or misunderstanding. It did not succeed secondarily because Roe Calloway sat in the witness chair and answered every question the prosecution put to him with the same accuracy he had provided to Hart on the morning after the arrest without softening a single detail. It did not succeed at all. Aldous Wheeler was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 18 years. Lavinia Wheeler was convicted on reduced charges and received a sentence of 3 years reduced further in exchange for full cooperation with the investigation into the remaining community members who had held formal roles in maintaining the practice. Of the 21 names in the notebook, 14 were matched to records of women with origins in towns and counties that the federal investigation contacted. 14 families received in the spring of 1874 a letter from the office of the U.S. Marshal informing them of what the record showed and what had been confirmed and what legal action had resulted. Ellie had petitioned Hart to include in each letter the specific name and known history of their family member, so that the letter was not a bureaucratic document about a case, but a document about a person. 7 names could not be matched to living family. For those 7, the federal record contained as much as the notebook contained, which in some cases was very little, and in some cases was more than Ellie had expected from a woman keeping private records in a secret room over the course of 40 years. The investigation into the broader community resulted in 4 additional convictions of lesser charges and the voluntary departure of most of the remaining families from Callaway Mountain over the following 2 years. The road stayed passable. The water rights reverted through a territorial court ruling to the individual property holders whose land the water ran through. The community that had sealed itself off from the world for 50 years and called its isolation tradition dissolved in the way that sealed things dissolve when the outside air finally gets in. The Callaway Ranch remained. Ellie traveled to Helena to testify in the late days of March and returned to the mountain at the beginning of April. When the road opened and the morning she came back, the light on the mountains was the particular light of early spring, at elevation clear and thin and full of the specific kind of promise that comes from things that have been cold for a very long time, beginning to warm again. On a morning in June of 1874, in a ceremony at Orson Reed's cabin conducted by a traveling circuit preacher who had been coming up the mountain for 20 years and who performed the service with the straightforward brevity that Ellie had specifically requested, she and Harlan Callaway were married. The witnesses were Jasper and Rowe and Orson Reed and Rennick Hart, who had come up from Helena for reasons he described as checking on the status of the investigation site, but which everyone present understood were something else. When the service was over, Harlan looked at Ellie in the morning light outside the cabin with the expression of a man who has not yet learned how to say what he means when what he means is important, but who has committed to learning. And she looked back at him with the expression of a woman who recognizes a work in progress and is not discouraged by it, and they walked out together into the June morning on the mountain. On a morning in late April, before the trip to Helena, Ellie had gone to the eastern slope one last time. The federal investigation team had been there in November and again in February, and the work they had done was documented and filed, and the positions had been treated with the care that the law required of evidence in a case of this nature. There were stakes at each of the 7 positions with small numbered tags. There were photographs taken with a field camera. There were descriptions in the official record of what had been found and where. There were no formal markers yet. That was a separate process and would take time. Ellie stood at the edge of the 7 positions in the morning light. The pines above her were beginning to show the first green of the season, at the tip of each branch the color of things that have been dormant deciding to be alive again. The ground was soft with the particular softness of spring, everything giving and wet and expectant. She opened the small notebook she had brought with her, not the official notebooks, not the leather record. Her own notepad, the same one she had begun filling in Boston on the afternoon she had read Harlan's letters and found the warning inside the envelope. She had written their names at the end of the notepad in the final pages on the night she had first read the full list. She turned to those pages now. She read each name aloud, standing at the edge of the eastern slope in the spring morning. Not loudly, not as a performance. Quietly, the way you say a thing that needs to be said to the person it belongs to when that person is the only one who has been waiting to hear it. 21 names, 21 times. She had the names of 14. For the 7, she did not have full names, for she said what the notebook gave her, which was enough to make each one distinct, which was enough to make each one a specific person and not a number. When she was done, she stood quietly for a moment. The pines moved in the light April wind, and the mountains were what they had always been, and the morning was what it was. Then she turned to the first blank page after the names and picked up her pencil and wrote at the top of the page, 7 names still unknown, family histories unconfirmed. Begin again. She looked at the lines she had written. She looked out at the slope and the pines and the mountains beyond. She turned back to the page and started writing what she needed to do first.